Welcome to another episode of Solid Ground. In the build up towards Easter, I'm going to be going through over various components of the gospel. Hence, the topic for this week is Jesus God? Now, there are a couple of ways I could go about to show that Jesus is God. However, the focus for today is how did Jesus address himself whenever he spoke about himself? What did he call himself? The title which Jesus used to address himself whenever he spoke about himself is the Son of Man. So what does the Son of Man mean? The term Son of Man is actually a divine title, and any first century Jew will be able to tell you that anyone who makes the claim that they are the Son of Man, coming on the clouds of heaven, seated at the right hand of the power, that person making that claim is claiming to be God. And Jesus made that claim for himself, as I will show you in the next few minutes. Now, when you read the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you'll notice that Jesus is regularly addressed as the Son of Man. This is the title that Jesus preferred for himself, and it is used over 80 times in the Gospels. Every time this title is used, Son of Man, it is used to address Jesus alone and no one else. So let us now take a look at the earliest Gospel, which is the Gospel of Mark. In Mark chapter 2 verse 10, Jesus says that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Now, why is Jesus saying that he can forgive sins when everyone in their culture and context knew that only God is the one that can forgive sins? If God is the only one that can forgive sins, and Jesus is saying that he can also forgive sins, then the only logical conclusion is that Jesus is claiming to be God. Now, in Mark 2:28, Jesus is saying he is Lord over the Sabbath. Keeping holy on the Sabbath is the fourth of the 10 commandments created by God. By Jesus proclaiming that he is Lord over the Sabbath, he is saying he is Lord over the 10 commandments. Now, if God is the one who created the 10 commandments, and Jesus is saying he is Lord over the 10 commandments, then the logical conclusion is that Jesus here is claiming to be God as well. Now, some people may object and say that in the Old Testament, Ezekiel was called the Son of Man too. Does that make him God as well? That's actually a good question. However, when you contrast the use of Ezekiel Son of Man with the use of the Gospel Son of Man, we see a big difference. In Ezekiel chapter 3, Ezekiel is described as the lowly prophet who's bound out in ropes and not able to do anything about himself. He's also seen as the prophet who's eating in fear and trembling. Every time the word Son of Man is used in Ezekiel, it's used to address the lowly prophet himself. This is quite different from the Son of Man as portrayed in the Synoptic Gospels. In the Synoptic Gospels, we see that the Son of Man has the ability to forgive sins, he's the Lord over the Sabbath, and he's coming on the clouds of heaven with his angels to collect his elect. This Son of Man in the Gospels is very different from the Son of Man as referred to in Ezekiel. So the question then becomes, is there anywhere else in the Old Testament that talks about the Son of Man? Well, there certainly is. When you take a look at the Old Testament in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 7 verse 13 to 14 reads as such. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming, and he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. This Son of Man mentioned above is the same Son of Man that Jesus boldly declares himself to be in front of the high priest and Sanhedrin in Mark chapter 14 verse 62. Just to give you some context, at the start of Mark chapter 14, we see Jesus being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, and now he's placed in front of the high priest and Sanhedrin who are looking for reasons to kill him. Upon further interrogation, the Sanhedrin and high priest, they ask him this: "Are you Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And how does Jesus respond? He responds by saying this: "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power, coming on the clouds of heaven." What's so significant about this answer? What does Jesus mean when he says this? The Sanhedrin and high priests who knew the Old Testament scripture really well knew exactly what Jesus was talking about. Jesus was referring to a specific passage in the Old Testament found in the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 7 verse 13 to 14, which I shall now explain in detail. So what does Daniel chapter 7 says? First you have the Ancient of Days, which is God, and then now you have this Son of Man who's approaching him, coming on the clouds of heaven. Let's expound on that meaning. It is said that the Son of Man comes on the clouds of heaven. This is only something only divine beings do in the Old Testament. For example, in Isaiah chapter 19 verse 1, it shows God coming with the clouds. So it seems that this figure in Daniel chapter 7 has a divine flavor to him. Even Allah in the Quran is seen as coming on the clouds in Surah chapter 2 verse 210. We keep going and we see that this Son of Man is given an everlasting kingdom. Well, that will be only one everlasting kingdom, and that is heaven. Moving on, we see that he is given eternal dominion over that kingdom. So whoever this Son of Man is, he has eternal dominion over heaven. And finally, it says that all people, nation, and men of every language will serve him. Now, when we look at the word serve in Greek, This word is called latruo. It is used 130 times in the Greek Old Testament and New Testament. And every time it is used to dictate a service that is due to God alone. That is a service that wouldn't be given to any other person or friend or even an earthly king. It is service due only to God. At this point, we see in Mark chapter 14 verse 62, Jesus publicly declaring that he will be coming on the clouds of heaven just as God does. He will have eternal dominion over every nation and every language, so that these people may serve him with service only due to God. We also see Jesus making another claim where he's seen being seated at the right hand of the power. This is another direct quotation from Psalm 110 verse 1, which is another indicator of being divine. This right hand of God concept was understood in ancient Judaism as a metaphor for Yahweh's power. In other words, to say that the Messiah sits at the right hand of God is to say that whenever God shows his glory and power, the Messiah will be the one that displays this glory, power, and majesty of God. Essentially, what Jesus was saying to the Jews was this: even though the Jews were judging him at the moment, there will come a time when Jesus will judge them as the Lord in Psalm 110 verse 1 and the divine Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7 verse 13 to 14. Essentially, the high priest and the council, when they heard this claim made by Jesus, they charged him with blasphemy. This claim made by Jesus infuriated the Jews, and it is no wonder why the Jews charged Jesus with blaspheming and they went on to rip their clothes, which is actually a sign of anguish in their culture. If Jesus was just a man or making a claim to be a prophet, it doesn't make any sense for the Jews to rip their clothes. The only reason why they ripped their clothes was because Jesus claimed to be equal with God, and in that culture and context, that was considered blaspheming. And if Jesus was lying, he would have been blaspheming. So to summarize what we just learned, there's only one title that Jesus used for himself more than any other title in the Synoptic Gospels, and that title is called the Son of Man. We have identified that this Son of Man refers to the Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7 verse 13 to 14. In Daniel chapter 7, this Son of Man is introduced as a divine figure coming on the clouds of heaven that will have eternal dominion over heaven and earth, and all nations will worship and serve him with a service due only to God. Jesus made this claim for himself in the public square, and that is why the high priest accused him of blaspheming. He was blaspheming because he was identifying himself with God. This gives us great insight into the question whether Jesus is God or not, and it also helps us understand what the author was trying to communicate in the first gospel. Jesus was not a man, nor a prophet, nor an angel, or a holy person. Jesus was identifying with God himself, and that is why he rose from the dead 3 days later after he was crucified. If any of you found this video useful, remember to like this and share this with your friends. If any of you have a different point of view, I'll be more than open to listening and hearing what you have to say. However, in the meantime, always remember this: follow the evidence wherever it leads. I love you guys.